And we're live. And Alexis, it's a pleasure to chat with you.
I'm excited to be here. I'm so flattered that you asked me and that you were brave enough to make this go live all of a sudden. I've never done a live on Substack,
Yeah,
despite being here for quite some time.
yeah. Well, neither have I. So we're breaking new ground here. Um, and I've enjoyed reading your Substack, and I love your mission, which is to delight you with historical truths, hard-won triumphs, and wage a relentless campaign against historical amnesia and all the messy contradictions in between. So how long have you been doing the Substack?
I've been doing it since 2021 during the pandemic. I would have never thought of myself as a newsletter person. I like to receive them. And I also do the same, I say the same thing about podcasts, but I've hosted podcasts and I love listening to them. But I was approached by Substack, and the timing was pretty significant. It was 2021 and all the archives were closed. My Washington book had come out, but it had only been out for a few weeks before the pandemic started. And so Substack said, basically publish as once a week. We suggest two. Here are a bunch of perks and a modest, advance of sorts. Best of luck out there. And I have really enjoyed it. That ended in 2022, and I've kept the Substack going, not quite as consistently perhaps as I once did, but I go to it when I moved, and I feel like the readers who come along for that ride are with me.
Great. Yeah. And another thing that you've been doing, which really resonated with me, is that you did a 13-stop cross-country tour for New America, where we're both senior fellows. And the project was called How Should a President Be, in anticipation of the 250th birthday of the U.S., which is coming up next July 4th. 2026 on July 4th. And I'm just curious, now that we've been through the first 100 days of the Trump second presidency, how do you reflect on the U.S. celebrating this anniversary at this particular time in history?
I think celebrating is such an interesting word, right? It was a discussion tour, this 13-stop discussion tour, and New America is full of incredibly ambitious and intellectually stimulating people who are working on incredible policy projects. And they were like, 13 stops is a little bit much, and it wasn't. It's not like I was giving a keynote at every single place. I was really approaching it with a sense of curiosity. And it was to get myself out of my echo chamber, because I'm very often, on the same panels and platforms with the same people. And I wanted to go a little bit far afield, including some of those were virtual. And some of them were on places I also had never done a live talk. One was on Instagram, or two were on Instagram. Was Sharon McMahon, who's a very big government teacher. And then I did a Substack with Jamel Bowie. I did a TikTok live with Jamel Bowie. He's very good at that platform. It highlights all his various attributes, which is great. And then, there were more traditional stops: the Ford Presidential Library, the New York Historical Society, which is always such a grand experience, whether you're in the audience or you're on a panel on the stage. And I learned a lot. But your question was, what do I see now? What's the celebration 250? What I wanted was these three goals, and I approached all the work. This is what I went there with, not so much a thesis as a question, and sort of an approach to America's 250th. So America is turning 250th. We've already had some milestones. The First Continental Congress has already happened, and that was, of course, very significant. Now I was mostly under Biden when I was conducting this. And so the three goals, which remain the same at New America, are pride in the founding, which of course you get some looks for when you say, so you have to follow very, very quickly with a reckoning for the ways we've fallen short, which I think that can be true no matter what, no matter what you think of America. There are ways that America can always improve. There are ways that a person can always improve. And then finally, an aspiration for a better future. And of course, that can mean more inclusive, more prosperous, more egalitarian, centered on different and evolving ideals as the founders envisioned. I have not quite seen that happening yet. There's been obviously the persecution and targeting of history by the current administration. NEHs have been cut. The archivist of the United States, Colleen Shogan, was fired. And actually, she was not a part of the documents. Like, she didn't request them, but she was persecuted for it. We see presidential libraries. We know the Carter Center has to run different speakers by the federal government now. That's never happened. So I would say I haven't seen much except bad news. I certainly haven't seen much celebrating. And so I am a little bit afraid it's going to become something fairly empty, like a step above President's Day, but steps below even July 4th, which, I mean, we don't even really talk about what the 4th of July symbolizes that much. There's a quick reflection. So not great.
Yeah. And, one of the ideas that Trump has been pushing is this notion of a garden of American heroes, a sculpture garden.
Yes.
And I think it's supposed to be only sculptures with a positive slant to them. Um, but an interesting list of, I think, 250 names, probably more diverse list than some people might imagine. But just curious, what do you think of the overall idea?
I think,
Where's it?
yeah. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because there were so many years in which we talked about um, monuments, 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 and as a historian, it's somewhat amusing, right? Because most people don't even notice a monument unless it directly sort of targets them. So in the South, you'll often have like a leader of the KKK or someone who was a leader of the Confederates. And they will be immortalized in some sort of huge monument. And so it's almost like a reminder constantly of you are not safe, this is not your place, and also a reminder of really painful history. We don't get a lot from monuments there. I mean, at most, right, you can get like a little plaque, maybe if it's a big one like the Jefferson Memorial or something, which is not what Trump has introduced as an idea. Those you'll get a little bit more, but you're not really learning history, right? And so to me, it's a great deal of expense for little to no payoff. It's going to be stationary, so it's not as if everyone can visit it. And as you know, its travel is a luxury for most people, and will be even increasingly as we move forth, and and we feel more and more of the effects of the tariffs and whatever sort of disastrous choices are being made about the economy. So I think it's pretty disappointing. In general, I'm not surprised. I think it's hard to have any sort of history where you're saying it's purely celebratory. I don't know a perfect person. I really don't. I've never met a perfect. The Pope, who recently passed away, would say he's not perfect. And I think that many of his critics would have said that as well. J.D. Vance, in particular, had some thoughts. And I think that the problem is, if you only introduce these perfect people, then you're not really telling the truth. And one thing that Donald Trump wins at, that I learned at from, and maybe it is the one thing he's winning at right now, that I learned from my tour at New America, the How Should a President Be tour, is that authenticity is really important to American people, and that he struck them as authentic, and other politicians really don't. And so it's difficult. His authenticity while it's very hard for some people to wrap their head around it, it's because it presents everything. He's not apologizing. He rarely even discusses, his marriages in a negative manner. It's always positive, positive, positive. Sometimes that's a good thing. I have to say, I was sort of surprised to listen to him talk about his daughter-in-law, Vanessa Trump, who's dating, a famous golfer. And so I think he likes that. But to listen to him talk about co-parenting and divorce in a positive way was almost jarring because he tends to come down so negatively. However, of course, those are really rose-colored glasses, and that's the literal only time I've ever seen him be positive about anything. So I think that is also in conflict with who he is, and that's when we see being Trump rare. Right now it's not even really working for Trump. It definitely doesn't work for other people. So I think whether it's history or members of the Republican Party or the sculpture garden, whatever it is, it's not going to work, and it's just going to be a big waste. And eventually more people will see it as they already are.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting take on authenticity. Um, One thing I like to do is occasionally take a walk in Central Park, and it struck me the last time I did it that, in a way, Central Park is a little bit like a garden of heroes, although not only American, it's overwhelmingly male,
Yes.
and it's a strange combination of William Shakespeare and Daniel Webster and so many others, um, but it just made me think, if you want to add some sculptures, maybe the place to start is add a few more to Central Park.
Central Park, or, I have always said this will not obviously happen under Trump, but I've always said that a physical monument example of what he's describing and what we're describing is this only celebratory history in which you really don't have any sort of complexity, because in this mindset, complexity is a liability, which I do not subscribe to. Complexity is what makes anything interesting. Why do we have flavors that have more than one flavor in them? Because that makes something interesting. Why do you season your meat? Why do you do anything? Because you need a little spice, just for a good story. And as a historian, there's so many good stories, but I have always maintained, and this is borrowed from Frederick Douglass, that the Washington Monument, right? You can see it from anywhere in DC, but it is just a phallic symbol. It is a obelisk. It is just a tall pillar, and it is made of stone, and you can't grab onto anything. It tells you nothing about George Washington. So Washington Monument, Washington Monument. Excuse me. It tells you as much as the name of Washington D.C. And so um, Frederick Douglass had suggested that we, instead of getting rid of monuments or building more, that we complicate the ones we already have. And so the Washington Monument, an amazing, which is closest to the Smithsonian for African American History, which is obviously under siege. You could put enslaved people. People are like, oh, he was a man of his time. So were they. So were they. And so were the people who were constantly trying to influence him and did influence his eventual road to emancipation. Only one man walked free the day Washington died. I'm, of course, a Washington scholar, so I have to bring it back to him. But I think that is something we could see hundreds of people reflected and a sort of climbing.
Yeah, very interesting. I'm glad you brought up Washington because it's an opportunity to talk about your really, you know, uh, groundbreaking book on,
Thank you.
with that wonderful title, "You Never Forget Your First." Uh, but what did you take away from studying Washington?
I mean, the beauty of being a historian and of having a book that people still want to talk about so many years later. Last year for President's Day, the Washington Post wrote something as if it had just come out, which was really exciting because it still feels fresh. And that also, though, I'd like to lodge a complaint, which is that it feels fresh because while I succeeded in sort of one of the great goals of my career, which is to get diversification as far as readership in presidential history so that it's not sort of a for us, by us, about us thing, which is white men. I do think it all is in concert. I didn't so much succeed at getting greater diversity for presidential historians. And so my great wish is that I can, train a little army. But so far that hasn't happened. But I think the reason, I think that Washington stays with me and he changes over time, just like anyone. They say books are not children, you know, but I disagree. I just think they go off to boarding school and you see them in the world and you hope they're doing well and making good choices, but you're not totally sure. Um, I think for me, Washington, parts of Washington that I thought were very and still are very important are just not the things that I focus on today. Obviously, I did not think that I would be talking about the peaceful transition of power a lot when I started writing the book. I sold it in 2016, and I've been thinking about it for a few years before that. I did not, that was supposed to be purely, it was a no brainer kind of thing. I don't want to say purely ceremonial because it was always really important. But, for it to be something I reference all the time, the farewell address, I cannot get enough of it. I always really liked it. But then I did something really fun this President's Day, which is a very long winded answer to your question, which is I thought, okay, I've been talking about his farewell address a lot, and it's not just that I want to shake up history that other people have done. I'm constantly applying those standards to myself, and one thing that I really wanted to do was revisit drafts of the farewell address. I'd also written about a candle that he, one of those little like old fashioned candle holders that Washington had written under, as he revised the farewell address. And I wrote about those drafts, which I hadn't done before for Slate, and they let me do the most academic thing for thank you to Slate and Rebecca Onion, who usually does allow me to do something like this and come along for the ride. I did cut lines and we called them excess lines, excise lines. And these were fascinating because at this point, I feel like your viewers, your readers, they probably know that Washington warned against foreign entities, foreign powers, and of course, political parties. He's our only president to have never declared a political party at any point, but like was very obviously a federalist. That's why the whole Hamilton and Jefferson thing, Jefferson was right in that Washington did always side with Hamilton because he was a Federalist. And that was his worldview. And he was, opposed to anything that Jefferson really believed fundamentally about government. But these lines were fascinating because it went beyond that. Washington said, sure, if we lose the military, if political powers are, just caring about power and they're not sort of trying to even satisfy their constituency, that everything, it paves the way for a despot, absolutely. But then he named a third group. And the third group was what I got to write about for Slate. And the third group, he described them as, people who have no ties to government. So they're not political parties, they're not lobbyists, they're not, people who we know who JP Morgan, the head of big banks, we know they have ties to government. No, no, these are people who were born into wealth and never really did that. They're businessmen who are not American. They are, they're in charge of print, something like that. So basically, he was naming tech oligarchs, media tycoons, people who were born to money or made it, and who they have no ties, whether it's an Elon Musk, and we see, I mean, that hypocrisy after the birtherism, um, either like an Elon Musk character or it's the entire dais at the inauguration. And so for me, Washington, none of these guys had crystal balls, but they did understand how government works, just like the fascist historians are like, check mark for all these things that are happening now. It's unfortunately not that creative of a list. And so I would say that Washington is constantly evolving to me, and it's very fun.
Yeah. And what do you think? You mentioned the Federalists and some of the things that Washington warned against. It's interesting to me. I did a post after the Alien Enemies Act was invoked by Trump to justify the deportation without any due process of
Right.
people to El Salvador. And but John Adams,
Sorry.
who succeeded
Yes.
Washington, just like he presided over some of the most repressive,
Mm-hmm.
you know, legislation in U.S. history. They prosecuted 20 anti-federalist journalists or newspaper publishers. Um, just interesting to me how Adams didn't pay that much attention, I guess, to what Washington warned about.
Precedents are, it's like pinky swearing. It just doesn't, it's not a great system. And this has been something that I've spoken about quite a bit since the is what we I feel like it's so casual now since the insurrection. I have been, and I really say it like that because as a historian, whenever I say that, I don't want to just say January 6th, the insurrection. I really want it to mean something. Um, because it is abnormal. And what we usually see in times of abnormality is some sort of correction, some sort of course correction. And we simply so you have, with Adams and the press, we didn't really see that after Nixon. Even, there are these norms that people and presidents are always pushing, but they're not pushing the same things all the time. Nixon never called, Bernstein and Woodward enemies, or called for them, liars, or, it's just they were too good. They're like too good at what they did. And so I think the problem is one of the, I would say, the most pessimistic pieces that I wrote in the last year. And I say that as ostensibly, I think it probably tracked that way, but I want people to understand that after spending so many years saying there's no precedent for this, there's no precedent for this, I need to sort of, there's a pretty big asterisk there, which is there is a precedent for a lot of this. There's no precedent for an insurrection. There's no precedent for a peaceful transition of power being, upended. There's no precedent when Adams took office and, targeted journalists. Although we really defined journalists differently then. Um, we had partisan newspapers. There was no one was pretending to be objective. But what we haven't, in MSNBC, I think this one was in MSNBC where I wrote, he's precedented too. And one of the things that we, whatever you name about Trump, I can tell you has a deep rooted history on both sides. So you have bigotry in the office. You name a president who has an on record somehow being incredibly bigoted in a way that is not mainstream, that is not George Washington, for all his many, even as an enslaver, when he lived in Philadelphia, after 6 months, technically by local law, he should have emancipated the people who he enslaved and brought to work for him because he didn't want to pay wages. But instead, he would bring them right to the line, cross the go into Virginia or whatever for the weekend and then come back. And so the clock would reset and people escaped. And of course, there's a great book, Never Caught, about Ona Judge. And so we have, and Ona Judge also appears in my book, and Hercules and other people who, were enslaved and self-emancipated. Um, which is what we call, another way of saying escape, because escape makes it sound like they're in prison and there has been some sort of due process, and that of course is never the case. So we have, presidents who have broken laws in different ways, a little bit more carefully. Trump's problem is he always says the quiet part out loud. We have presidents who have said, terrible things. Reagan, of course, said the thing about, African nations in the UN never wearing feet and looking like, or never wearing shoes and looking like monkeys. You could name any president, probably with the exception of Barack Obama, against certain groups, but then who knows? We have in mind everything he said about every single group. No one is, again, a perfect person or without any sort of bigotry. Transactional, absolutely. Any, you name a president, I can tell you how they benefited, maybe with the exception of Carter. But again, never this much, and certainly not in office.
Do you think, of course, famously, Trump talked in his inaugural address in January about this becoming a golden age for America, which first 100 days has not delivered. But
Yes.
is it a golden age for presidential historians? In that there's much more interest, I think, in what happened in prior generations than maybe there's ever been.
I'm sorry, you cut out with the one with the I something about previous generation. I missed the thing you said right before.
Yeah, there's, I think, much more interest in
Yes.
what's happened with Andrew Jackson or Woodrow Wilson
Yes.
or Teddy Roosevelt or McKinley or FDR.
Yes. Yes and no. Right. The first time I felt, the presidency has never been fashionable, and it's not really, I always get a lot of sideways glances about it. I always have. In graduate school, I focused on citizenship, which is, of course, as we know, tied to the presidency. But I was always curious about it. But I wanted to become a professor. I wanted tenure at that time, and you could not study the presidency and be taken that seriously. You could go to the Miller Center, you could go to certain places, but I wanted a sort of wider range. I wanted to go back to California as well. I'm from California, if you couldn't already tell from my accent. Um, and then over time, however, it became more acceptable. But I wouldn't say anyone, when I said I was writing a book about George Washington for years, and I was hosting an Audible podcast and a podcast for The Wing, and they were winning Webbies and such, and I would mention this, or it would be in my bio, people would be like, so a little bit of a disconnect. We're going to just, roll on by that weird statement. And then Trump was elected. And suddenly there was this urgency that was so exciting for someone like me, because everything is a teachable moment. The thing about, I think I got this. I worked at the NYPL after grad school, the New York Public Library with the lions, famous from Ghostbusters, and I worked on exhibitions. And I think from that and from grad school and from working as a public facing intellectual, I can sort of make connections to anything. So it was fun for me. And I wrote a piece at the Times for the New York Times Magazine. Um, and it was a letter of recommendation. They have this great series. And I recommended, of course, presidential libraries, and presidential biographies in particular, because it's not, yes, you will get an overview, and you will learn about, oh, Andrew Jackson did this, and this person did this, and that's why Trump is doing that. Absolutely. Why does he worship this person? Why does he hate that person? Why does he feel competitive with Lincoln? Was the war really about slavery? Whatever. Yes, all those details will come to you. But there's one important takeaway that I do think is really great for people, which is what they tell you most of all is that it was never okay. That at any point in history, everyone was panicking. Everyone thought the world is going to move ahead without America. America will lose its place in the world. And I have to say, sometimes you get it from their perspective. It's sort of like talking to a child. I see you're upset. I understand how you're feeling. I can see how that would feel that way. But now it actually is at that point. Unfortunately, again, we have these almost like lists where, oh, this is how a democracy dies. This is how fascism works. But now I think what I've noticed is, in particularly with commentary is less invested in what historians have to say. One, because Trump they still haven't figured out how to cover him. And so he's still dominating the news, and making it run as fast as possible in every which direction. And the other thing is, they so many years of no precedent, they're buying it. And so they'd rather just go with the no precedent, and talk to political scientists, which is a different beast altogether, and such. So that has been interesting, because I think that's true, and I think that's not true, of course. Um, and so there's some balance. I would like a little bit more time. You never get to talk about it anyway that long. Is there a precedent for this? And then you say it, and they're like, oh, there's a car door opening and a president's getting out. So thank you so much for your time today on whatever the channel is. But I do think we would do well in general in every single way that we cover Trump and history, to just slow down. It's possible. It's possible. We can do it.
Yeah. And is there something, I mean, I've been doing a lot of research for my Substack posts into history, and I do find it somewhat therapeutic that we survived some episodes that were so traumatic at the time. Is there any comfort to be taken?
You know, yes and no. We survived. I'm thinking about, okay, wars, right? You have people who survived war. Let's think about Japanese internment. Uh, we survived, right? They survived. Harbor was bombed, and Hawaii is intact today, and people live there and enjoy traveling there. And but lives were lost. And in Japanese internment camps, when people went, they returned Yes, they got to leave, but that when they returned home, their homes had been taken over by other people. Their businesses had been looted. There was a tremendous amount of racism against them. There was the threat of violence constantly, or it was enacted. Every way of the quality of life, joy, the pursuit of happiness, right? Which is not just like, oh, you can go be happy. Here's an endorphin blast. It's that you are free to live peacefully and pursue your goals and live however you and the people you choose to love choose to live within the laws of the land. And so, yes, we have survived, but we have not survived as strong as we were. And for a movement that says that we're doing so poorly, no president has ever really caused this much damage who has not been at war, who is not recovering from a depression or is in the middle of a pandemic. No one has really done this much and this little with what he has. So I hear everyone on wanting to say that. I'm just not sure it's true. And I also know, that things will not be the same for a long time. So we have women who are dying, who want to have children, who are having children. Things happen, things go wrong, and they're dying because of it. That's never happened, in America for a long time. And so there are real consequences that seem anecdotal and they're not. I also think that we've never ever had a president who has challenged the courts in this way. So there are things that are different this time around. So I don't know if we're going to be okay by our standards, certainly not by the standards of American exceptionalism in this like lovely bubble we've all been living in for a long time. 9/11, those things, yes, they have shaped our lives. I'm an elder millennial. I have lived through many recessions at this point, but this is different. And so life is going to go from hard and hey, we can't afford a house based on the income and all of the, it's going to go, this isn't about not buying coffee. It's about um, basic basic education if we don't have the Department of basic things that we will not have. So I'm not so sure I subscribe to. I'm sorry for the pessimistic view that it's going to be okay, not by our standards. And I think we need to uphold our standards and our boundaries as a country.
I think that's a really good point about sort of the long-term consequences of something like the Japanese internment or
Yes.
the deportations that may be happening right now.
And going back to your point about the Washington book and about my work in general, is that's what I try to think about quite a lot, not just the long term effects, but outside of our own personal experiences, not only as people alive today, but as people who, I am in Rhinebeck, New York. I'm not in the city. I'm north of it, but I live on Main Street. I'm surrounded by Trump voters. So I always like to say, like, I live on Main Street. I understand, but they love my work weirdly. And, there is at the same time, I think that we just need to be really realistic about what's happening and understand that everyone is threatened by this. If anyone is deported, we are all threatened with it. And you can read that in the writing. It's not paranoia anymore. It's what they're saying. And my goodness, have we not been taught to respect what they're saying and understand and believe it? It will happen.
And right now, I know you're working on a book about the young JFK. How did that come about, and does that have any kind of relationship to the environment we're experiencing right now?
It's funny. Someone said to me the other day, "Oh, so you're just going to do all the big presidents?" And it's like, if someone would pay me to write a book on Chester A. Arthur, done. I would do it in a second. But that's just not how it works. And the reason these presidents are talked about so much is that they greatly influenced the nation and they left such a lasting impact. And so they needle me in this way where if there's something I can't quite figure out, despite these people having been around my whole life and having heard quite a lot about them, then that's the way it starts. It's like scratching an itch. It started with Washington, and then I pursued something that seemed off to me. It seemed hanky, and then I looked into it, and sure enough, it wasn't true. And another interesting part, you asked me, we started this, and you asked me about my Substack, Study Mary Kill. It started during the pandemic when all the archives were closed. I proposed this book when the archives were closed, and that it was the scariest experience of my life. I was coming off 3 weeks of a very successful book tour and then a screeching halt. No one knew what Zoom was. We weren't talking about these things. It was just canceled. And I know a lot of people didn't get a chance to do any of those things, and I have a lot of empathy for that. But at that point, I was like not feeling, I was in a place of uncertainty, but I had a decade earlier been in CNN's Kennedys, and I had written about the Kennedys, and I knew my questions. They had been sort of swirling. And I thought, okay, this doesn't sound right. This doesn't sound right. So the proposal itself was about 20 pages of very informed decision, like questions. Here's all I know about this question I have. And this is why I think it can't be right. This doesn't make sense. So I was sort of talking about the in the negative without presenting anything in the positive. And as a historian, you have to sort of present things in the positive. And, somehow they all believed me. They all bid on it, which was great. But the good news is the person who won Crown, they are gonna get their money's worth because I've not just found new things, I found 3 categories of new things, which is really fun. So I think the takeaway here is that, yes, these are presidents who have been covered, Washington, and Kennedy, but everything needs a second look, and every president, every, I would say, person of interest needs new storytellers, new visions, and that will be the same for the people who I cover. I would love for someone to come up right behind me and find all these new things that I missed, and I'd be so frustrated, but it would be great.
So you were able to get into the archives after.
Eventually, I was, and those heroes, the editors who work in these archives are absolute heroes. And they were constantly, when they were allowed back in the building, they were constantly, like responding to my emails, and not just as sort of, oh, yes, I think this is true, or here's a attached document. Like they think about it and they research and they look into it. And then these moments of incredible generosity. So, for example, I'm obviously in this world of scholarship, and I needed an oral history in Columbia. It was backed up. I wasn't going to get it for a long time as the pandemic, and I wasn't as clear as who they had on the ground there as the JFK Library. And Evan Thomas, the author, his father edited Profiles in Courage, JFK's book. And I said, oh, do you just happen to have a copy of this oral history? I know his daughter, Louisa. And Evan said, sure, I'll send it to you. I have the original copy of an oral history upstairs in my office. And then John Shaw, who runs an institute in Illinois, a presidential history institute, he went and researched in the 90s because, primary sources don't change. We get more access and we think more critically. He sent me in the mail just like a huge box of things, which I've now kept, I think, for a year longer than he probably wanted, but there's no pressure there. So I think it was also about being resourceful. I couldn't travel, but schools had returned at another archive that was far flung. So I asked, on Twitter when Twitter was still useful, that it was great for this sort of thing. I asked, who is your best student at this school? I was not familiar with the school, and someone said, "This is my best undergrad. She will do a good job, and she'll learn something from it." And that for me is like the duality of someone who's really obviously great, and I can try. It's hard not to do the research yourself. It's so much fun. So it's also just like deny. It's like going to a dessert bar and not having dessert. Just like writing down impressions of the dessert, or looking at it and maybe having like a little bite. I mean, it's not that bad, but takes away the fun, the sleuthing. But then also someone I can teach. And I really, really try to show my research assistants how I think and to be creative in their process. And they tell me they've learned something. So I hope so.
Great. I can't wait to read that book. It's coming next year, right?
It's coming next year. I'm waiting on edits, and I'm pretty excited about it.
Anything else you wanted to talk about?
Um, I mean, obviously today is 100 days. And I think that I'm curious your impression of this. You worked in news for a long time. And you have a history bent. We are here not actually because we're both senior fellows at New America. That's a coincidence. But that I wrote a piece for CNN, and you at the time were at the helm of the editorial, machine that was happening. And so I am curious, I lightly disparaged, I cast aspersions on the media for the way they cover Trump. As someone who worked in media and who also is deeply invested in history, what do you see at this moment? How do you think people could be covering Trump differently? And what do you think history should be doing to respond to the moment?
Well, putting on my journalist hat, I'm really thankful for the reporting that we've had. I think that has been, I think, great reporting has been the biggest thing to take away from the first 100 days. That without a free media, we would have no idea what is really happening, and we have to hold on to that and cherish the media, and that is our potential salvation. I think. Um, I think 100 days, and I'm curious what you think about this, but it's such an arbitrary um, time period, and it's being, in a way, almost overcovered. Um, I guess it was
Yes.
FDR was the one who established.
FDR, yes. I mean, the thing is, um, most presidents do their most impactful work after 100 days. When a president comes in during, let's say, Great Depression, as FDR did, and I'm near Hyde Park, which I just want to say if you're ever in the Hudson Valley, go to Hyde Park. It's great. You're going to learn a lot. And particularly now, it's very informative. But they do great work. And you can also stream any of the presidential libraries. They stream all their events. I did one on Van Buren recently, and it was great. I think that FDR had it's like Biden coming in with with the COVID pandemic. People are in dire straits and one needs to get out a lot of things. But what's interesting is executive, we have he signed a lot of Trump has signed a lot of documents. But FDR, because he had this crisis, and Trump allegedly has a crisis at the border, crisis of this, whatever, tariffs, a lot of man-made crises over there. But FDR also man-made, but there was a Great Depression going on. So he signed 15 pieces of legislation. Now, that's different than an executive order, which is mostly for show. Um, Bills are different, right? The executive order, and this is, Congress for having, and that Congress is, this Congress is a totally different conversation. But what we have here is we have FDR, actually signing bills, actually making changes. And yes, Trump has caused a lot of chaos as he did the first time. The first 100 days we had the Muslim ban, we had protests, we had all these things. Um, but he hasn't actually accomplished that much. He's accomplished a lot of negative things in that he has the lowest approval rating of any president at this point, with the exception of Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford did very well coming in, despite the fact that he was taking over for Nixon. Nixon resigned, and he was the second vice president. So he had certainly ties to Nixon, but they weren't quite as deep or as complicated or as implicated as like Spiro Agnew, great name. And we have a lot of so Gerald Ford, but then when he pardoned Nixon, then things went awry, which now, though, is viewed as like maybe the right thing to have done at the time. But what we have here is approval ratings are down. The economy. is increasingly, it's not recovering even when he backs off. So he's had to, and I think we should say back down, right? That's a failure. The tariffs, while they're still going to hurt us, it's a failure. We have Trump saying, I rule the world, I do this. It's always been this like hubristic statement to say that America is the leader of the free world, but we very much see that it's not, free or not free. Trump loves dictators. We know that. He respects strong men. But China doesn't care about Trump. They have, he's made no progress with them. He says they're having talks. China's like, we're not having talks. So clearly, not only does America not lead the world, and America is increasingly being left out of discussions about other countries, about Ukraine, about all these other places. So we have a president who's not leading the world. And also, you have to think about national security. I tend to think about national security, which I think is the other sort of long game that a lot of people aren't. If China knows they're not having talks with Trump, and he's just lying because the emperor has new clothes and people are just going to compliment it. China isn't. So that means that China knows that we will just not say certain things as a country. So cyber attacks, actual terrorist attacks, all of these all put us at risk. Everything that Trump is doing puts us at risk as a country, and then of course as individuals who could be deported to Venezuela and put in a camp. No one fares well there.
Yeah, when you look at Trump's aggressive posture on many international fronts, Ukraine, Gaza, China, it makes you think of the Mike Tyson line that everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face.
Yes. I mean, that's true. And I mean, the presidency, everyone comes in with an amazing plan. One of the things I did was an Instagram live for my tour at New America. How should a president be? This 13 discussion stop tour. One of them was a Substack live with Kevin Cruz, who's a historian at Princeton. Has my favorite book is White Flight. But he talks a lot about, conservatism and the evolution of the presidency. And we talked about this gulf. He writes a Substack called, I think, Campaign Trails. We talked about this gulf between campaign promises and possibilities once you get to the White House. And that's true for any president, right? You're always buffeted by a series of events you can't control. Let's say like COVID. But what's interesting here is they had a plan, a very good one. They spent 4 years on it, Project 2025. But they don't seem to know what to do when they have the courts, they're breaking the laws, they're telling everyone they must do what they say, they have Congress, they have everything, and yet still no meaningful legislation, no progress on China, no forcing these tariffs on other people. We don't have Greenland. We don't have Canada's not another state. So I think that what's interesting is, and this happened to the only other non-consecutive president, Grover Cleveland, where we heard a lot about him when Trump was reelected, where he just failed to adjust to the moment in this really spectacular way. And that's when his party turned against him. And of course, with Nixon, the party turned against him with the tapes and when Watergate. And so what I'm waiting here is for something, right? And we'll see with midterms, but the party could, in a sort of fantasy world, turn against him. Democrats could win and have a resistance to him. The Supreme Court could actually stand by the Constitution, even originalist interpretations, like you name it, anyone but the Trumpian one works. So I don't know. We'll see. But
And
it's
a
not,
big,
I would say it's not successful. It's
yeah,
a very unsuccessful 100 days.
yes, and a big test, of course, is going to be the budget and the tax cut bill, where
Always.
where Trump actually has to get Congress to pass legislation. And I
Yes.
did a piece recently about Bill Clinton, who came into office promising a middle class tax cut and wound up imposing higher taxes on the wealthy because of the deficit. And I kind of pointed out he was, with his saxophone, he learned improvisation and applied that to his presidency.
He did. Not so much with with some of the truths and untruths, but economically he was sound. And you can criticize a lot of things about him, but I think the growth was something like 4%. Um and he sold it well. He had this way of, and again, I'm an elder millennial, not a fan. Uh he was part of my awakening, but I learned about Monica Lewinsky when I was in middle school. So, and of course we all are so happy that she's succeeded now. Could sort of fling him into the sun, but as a president, he was very good on the economy because he seemed to marry this Main Street and Wall Street vibe. He could speak as an intellectual, but had this really rough upbringing and this connection to a tougher existence that was less privileged. So he had the bootstraps. He really like owned that. He had performed it. He had been really successful, but he also had the numbers, right? And it's the economy, stupid, is what America always comes down to. It's the one unifying thing is our pocketbooks. And empires, you can talk about the fall of Rome, you can talk about all of these things. They've been felled while the barbarians are still en route. They've been felled by balance sheets. And so the economy will certainly um, be a reckoning for Trump. Of course, so many of us are like, "Why did it have to happen?" But it did. So here we are, and I think it's just going to be um, citizenship isn't easy. It takes work and sacrifice. And unfortunately, as a collective, we've made it much harder on ourselves than it needs to be. But here we are.
Yeah. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I have one last question, Alexis, which is where are you going to be on July 4th, 2026?
It's so funny. I actually don't know yet. I think that I will probably. I always go hard on President's Day. It's a bit of a blitz for me. But this year I wrote something like, I don't know, 6 or 7 op-eds and did media all the time. And President's Day is usually like that, in general. Um, I think I will probably be doing something like that. So you can certainly look out for me. I'll be doing my patriotic duty, and hopefully working on a second draft of that Young Jack book. But I will be fighting the good fight. And I think that's the thing. We're not all presidential historians, we're not all journalists, but we all are people who care deeply about maintaining the freedom for our way of life. And so everyone around July 4th might be doing something a little bit different than they've done in the past, which is a little, figuring out what they can do even on that day to make a difference. Because on a local level, that's where the resistance to any kind of oppression, local, federal, whatever it is, and not even oppression, to fight for the world that you want and the life that you want. That happens at home. So I hope we'll all be, eating some delicious barbecue, but also doing some of our civic duty.
Well, great, and hope to catch up with you before the actual 250th,
Yes.
to check in and see how things are going. Maybe at the end of the second 100 days.
We'll see. We'll see. Yeah, I hope for all of us. I hope we have something more from each side to hold on to for this. I would say that's my big wish for that. Less speculation, less like, well, this isn't happening and that's not happening. That might happen. And I think that will also help people and activate communities.
Great. Okay. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Take care.